complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Philo, welcome back to the Jay Verdon Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing very good. Life is going well, and very happy to be back on, and I really appreciate the kind of positive atmosphere and the good guests that you've been having lately. It's very entertaining.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to have you back on. I very rarely get any sort of specific feedback on a show. You know, most of it's like good episode, bad episode, right? But when I announced that you were going to be on, I had several people, you know, individually message me saying like, "Oh, I'm glad Philo's back on." And so I fear that I'm not the only one who's excited to have you back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. So much like last time, we are here to talk about something specific. So obviously, you know, everyone should follow Philo on his YouTube channel. That's linked in the description. But I think we should just jump straight into this because we've got quite a lot of ground to cover, and I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Absolutely.
All right. So you want to introduce our topic?
So the conflict today, the topic today is going to be the Israel-Palestine conflict, or more specifically, the Israel-Hamas conflict. Since October 7th, there was a Hamas-initiated terror attack or militant attack, however you want to deem it, within the geographic borders of Israel. Since then, Israel has launched a limited military operation within Gaza that struck everything from hospitals to UN workers. And around this conflict, there has been a resurgence of both the neoconservative, anti-Muslim, pro-Israel school of thought, where we should just attack and bomb and subjugate peoples that have differing worldview to our enlightened liberal one. And on the progressive left side of the equation, you have a resurgence in pro-Palestinian activism and support, and kind of a very intense feeling on either side, to the point where this conflict radiates externally through both media, which is constantly showing you via Google News that you should be outraged about this war, or on the opposite side, that it's a great genocide, that there's going to be a relocation, that the people of Palestine will all be moved to European countries, and that it's just another cynical funnel for the military-industrial complex. So really, this is a very complicated topic. I appreciate Mr. Burden's ability to have us wait for about a month or so after we initially planned this in order to get kind of a more zoomed out view. And my intention in this topic is to show the history of Zionism, the history of Israel, why Jews feel the way they do about the conflict, why some Jews are pro-Palestinian, and why the overall political establishment of the U.S. is pretty homogeneously pro-Israel.
And I think that the reason that this is important, because I have heard a certain bit of what in the UK context would be called like Little Englandism, you know, or is called with a kind of a derogatory sense in the US, isolationism. But it's the idea that, you know, this doesn't affect me directly, so it's not my problem. And from a certain level, that might be true, but you also have to understand that, you know, if you're in the US, it is your problem because your country is bankrolling it, and in a weird way, kind of bankrolling perhaps both parts of it. So maybe a discussion for later. But also, the more specific implications, you know, maybe to you and I, Philo, is that this has created kind of a crack in culture. You know, so you mentioned these two narratives, and one of the very interesting things is that the kind of march of current thing has broken down. You know, that if you kind of went back, you know, a year or so, it was very clear what, you know, quote unquote good people TM thought. You know, and they thought that, you know, Vladimir Putin is the devil, and the Ukraine war is, you know, 2 weeks away from ending. Now, that's sort of broken down. You know, there's a little bit of dissonance because you're right. You know, a lot of power is very pro-Israel, but a lot of culture is very pro-Hamas, or not probably pro-Hamas, is very pro-Palestine. And so, you know, being a dissident, it's sort of created this interesting crack in the narrative. So anyway, do you want to start at the top?
Yeah, for sure. The first kind of glaring question about this topic that I think most people on the right are thinking is, why is there so much effort from Jews to garner moral outrage and total consensus for their side? You see this in everything from the Ben Shapiro appearance at the Oxford Union debates to the third presidential debates on the Republican side to the New York Times. Most media seems to be highly, highly focused on getting you to be pro-Israel. And that's kind of alienating because, on the one hand, the United States has been broadly pro-Israel since at least the time of Reagan. Um, but on the other hand, you have this resurging progressive political agenda, which is arguing that the Palestinian side needs to be supported over the Israeli side. And this is often due to the prevalence of minority groups in the left coalition kind of finagling for power, trying to wrest more political power away from the Jews, who pretty undisputedly, I think, who was it? Whoever wrote the Israel Lobby um, is kind of the authoritative source on this, that goes into the nature of how U.S. politics is so centered on Israel. But I want to kind of start from the 40,000 foot view here, which is to analyze Zionism and then the evolution of Judaism in the 19th and 20th century, because that really gives you a view into the Jewish psyche and why they're seeking this outcome. There's a great book by Shlomo Sand called The Invention of the Jewish People. And he has a quote in it that says, "To retain control for a long time, it is not enough to possess visible power. It is necessary to produce ethical and legal norms. An educated stratum provides a hegemonic consciousness to underpin the class structure, so that it will not need to keep defending that structure by violent means." So I'm going to assert that Jews as a class are part of this educated stratum that's aiming to provide a hegemonic consciousness that sets this structure within the United States and the West in place. But where does it come from? How do we get here? The Reform Jewish Ashkenazis, of which I am one, in the 19th century sought the goal of what was called Haskalah, which means in Hebrew wisdom. Their goal was to intellectualize themselves, modernize Judaism in a Western vein, and superficially assimilate into Western countries, kind of blending the social norms of the West with their own Judaism. Many of the key figures within this movement were called the Maskilim, and primarily their goals as like a political ideology were universalism, liberalism, and progress. So this shouldn't sound unfamiliar to anybody steeped in kind of the origins of liberalism. One of the core features of Judaism, why Jews were moving towards this Haskalah, was that from the 1780s, like prior to the 1780s in the diaspora in Judaism, the Jews would live in a shtetl, and they would have their community where they would only speak Yiddish or Ladino or some other Hebrew Western language in order to preserve their culture. They pretty much never assimilated into the West unless it was through a very specific avenue regarding money or political control. Like, that's just a fact of it. Call it anti-Semitic if you like. But in the 19th century, as Jews became more westernized, they began to emulate the nationalism and the socialism and the communism that was prevalent starting after the 1848 revolutions. So one of the core features of Judaism that's not really known to non-Jews is that the Jews believe that they must be redeemed as a collective group in order to please God. This is a very stark contrast to the redemption of the individual within Christianity. So over the 19th century, Jews are trying to educate themselves, and the education is viewed as a route to this redemption. But this dream kind of shatters around 1880 when Russia starts to conduct pogroms against Ashkenazi Jews. Jews experience more and more of what they begin to label as anti-Semitism, which is anything that's an attack on them physically or them emotionally or intellectually, being shut out of universities, country clubs, political organizations. They don't really have an avenue to have a in-group preference in the West. So after this Haskalah comes the concept of Zionism. Zionism, I'm going to quote several key Zionist figures now. These are all people, and to understand the influence they have in Israel, every single rehov or street in the country pretty much is named after one of these Zionists. This is absolutely foundational to the Israeli identity and what contrasts it with the Western Jew. So one of them is named Eliezer ben Yehuda. He was the man who revived spoken Hebrew as a language instead of the mixed languages like Yiddish and Ladino. And he fiercely opposed Haskalah. So this nationalism that was beginning to arise needed a language, and it needed a land, and it needed this ethos. It needed this reason for existing. Um, one of these reasons comes from insecurity. So Max Nordau, famous Zionist, he gave his first speech to the first organization of the World Zionist Congress in 1897. So a bunch of European Jews, after the Dreyfus Affair in France in 1895, decided to coalesce and seek much more nationalist autonomy with themselves and between Jews of different parts of the world, kind of gluing Zionism together. There's a quote for why this is in his first speech. It's going to sound a little anti-Semitic, but I'm just verbatim quoting him. The Jewish spiritual misery, which is more painful than the physical because it affects men of higher station who are more prouder and more sensitive. The emancipated Jew, so the Haskalah westernized Jews, are insecure in their relations with their fellow men, timid with strangers, and suspicious even of the secret feelings of his friends. His best powers are dissipated in suppressing and destroying, or at least in the difficult task of concealing his true nature. He fears that this character might be recognized as Jewish, and he has never had the satisfaction of revealing himself as he is in his real identity. In every thought and sentiment, and every physical gesture, he has become a cripple within and a counterfeit person without, so that like everything unreal, he is ridiculous and hateful to all men of high standards. So from this insecurity comes Zionism, and those, the Haskalah and the Zionists, are the two very different strains of Judaism that are existing in the run-up to the state of Israel.
That's an interesting quote because it reminds me of another from my favorite book, All the King's Men. And this is a paraphrase, right? But it's kind of referring to that same insecurity. And it's talking about, the main character's awkwardness at being asked the question, could you tell that I was a Jew? Where it's like he now feels this kind of like secondhand embarrassment for someone who is kind of inherently insecure in their own identity. But anyway, sorry, carry on, Philo.
Yeah, there's a good parable here from the 19th century, which is that a German Jew gets on a train and he sits in one of the compartments and he puts his feet up on the bench opposite him, and kind of like blows his nose and is kind of generally doing stuff that's considered by Western standards to be, kind of lacking etiquette. And into the carriage comes a very, very well dressed, very strong looking, posh Western guy. And he sits down on the bench opposite from the Jew, and the Jew straightens up and sits upright and adjusts his clothes and is kind of minding his manners. And then he sees that the very well put together Jew opens up a newspaper in Hebrew. And then the kind of disheveled Jew goes, oh, it's all good. You're one of us. And then he puts his feet back up and continues his rude behavior. So this in-group preference and this insecurity about assimilation that exists is kind of shaping the Jewish consciousness. I would argue even to this day, it's a very sore point. And if you look at the recent kind of Jews being in the library on university campuses or Jews being assaulted in pro-Palestinian protests, this is something they can actively draw on as a well of insecurity about their identity because they're not really at home in Western countries. And the nationalist Israelis have kind of more negative view of Jews that are living outside Israel.
Well, and to go back to that theme, it's interesting that the entire conception of the Rainbow Coalition, right? The kind of what it means to be diverse is on one hand been helped by people of Jewish extraction, right? If you look at, certain foundations that promote this, and yet again, there's that same dynamic of sort of being out of place. And I don't say that triumphantly, it's obviously not proved to be a good thing for them, but when you see the arguments put forth in a book like Jews Don't Count, or what we're currently seeing on college campuses, it is clear that there is sort of an outsider status.
Absolutely. And this outsider status even occurs within Judaism. So one element that people outside Israel don't really know is how the survivors of the mid-century German action, I guess, how they were treated within Israel. Kind of the perception today is that because there's Yad Vashem and there's much more of a media campaign to glorify survivors, that generally Israel is very welcoming and very conscientious towards its own actual victim group. It kind of obfuscates the fact that this was not the case. Between the 1880s and the 1940s, there were 4 different waves of Jews making what's called aliyah, or right of return, to Israel. They basically moved from Europe to Israel, settle the land, farm it, fight off Arabs. They conduct themselves as a nationalist state. And they're very proud of this fact. They're very proud of the fact that they don't let themselves become victims, etc. So after World War II ends, all these Jews that have survived this event, they begin to emigrate to Israel. And the nationalist Israelis that are already living there look at this and they say to themselves, you guys are being weak, right? You let yourselves become victims. We didn't. We came and settled the land and worked hard. And survivors of this event were actually shunned off of buses. They were restricted from certain areas socially. They were treated very, very poorly in the early days of Israel from the 1950s to the 1980s. Many would cover up their number tattoos on their arms because they would get ridicule from the Israelis. And they also received very limited pensions from the state of Israel in their old age. So Israel does not have a good record of treating the survivors very well. And I want to contrast that with the nationalism of Israel. So Israel has been receiving monumental sums of reparations money from the German government. And this is a literal blood price. There was a huge dispute in the 1950s of, if we take their money, does this entitle them to forgiveness for their actions? It was a fierce debate, but eventually the pro-reparations side won out because Israel was in a period of economic austerity, which means they couldn't support their own economic development over time. In September 1952, West Germany paid Israel 3 billion marks, or $714 million. A sixth of this money went to the World Jewish Congress, which is a Zionist organization. The remainder of the money went directly to the state of Israel, who then used the money to sustain its own economy. So they built shipyards, they built weapons, they built civil infrastructure, they built highways. Very, very little of this money between the 1950s and 1980s actually went to the survivors. It's a huge controversy to this day that's not very publicized within Judaism, and Israel has kind of remade its image since then. And they've also requested additional money from Germany in 2007, 2009, 2010. So there's this ongoing kind of two-faced nature to try and get as much money as possible, but also to not really acknowledge within the Israeli consciousness the status of the victim, except where it serves to kind of propagate a cultural myth. It's also commemorated within the Israeli holiday structure. So there's 2 holidays that are back to back, one day after the other, Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, which is the remembrance of the Day of Independence and the remembrance for the mid-century German event. So there's this very interesting duality of conflict there. Why bring this up? Because I want to show that Israel as a country was not always unified the way that it was, and that this alienation between Western Jews and Israel is very actively permeating all of its history.
So I have a question, and you sent me your notes. This is not in your notes, so forgive me because this is just something that popped up. But how does this play into the Cold War more broadly? Because as far as I understand it, at least initially, Israel was much closer to the Soviet bloc. And then obviously it came around to being on sort of the NATO side. So what happened there? And is that relevant to this?
Absolutely. So, little known fact about Israel, but you can look at its legislative elections. So prior to its establishment as a state, Israel was socialist. The European Jews that were moving to Israel would exist in socialist communes. They'd have a socialist mindset. They were educated in European universities where they learned the nationalist writings of Germany and France and the UK. Were very steeped in that tradition, but with a socialist twist. Between 1948 and 1977, so after Israel was created, up until 1977, Israel was governed by the Mapai Avodah coalition. In Hebrew, Avodah means work, and Mifleget Paolai Eretz Yisrael means Workers' Party of the Land of Israel. So, like, make no mistake here, this is a national socialist government that's building kibbutzim, or collective farms, for their people to work and develop the economy of the state, which again, at this time is very poor. Because people were working collectively and so deeply imbued with the socialist mindset, on many of these kibbutzim, they raised children collectively without knowing their parents. So this, to answer your question, this put them ideologically much closer to the Soviet Union than it did the United States. Repeatedly throughout the 60s and 70s, Henry Kissinger made a very intense effort to try and reach an agreement, the Sinai Agreement, and the 1975 attempt as well under Gerald Ford to try and get Israel on board with liberalizing and westernizing and kind of avoiding this more socialist impulse. Ultimately, Kissinger failed in being able to settle the Israel-Palestine conflict, as has every successive United States government. But what's very interesting is that basically beginning in the late 1960s onwards, Israel has had a much higher esteem for the United States. And the United States has had much more support financially and militarily since the late 1960s. Part of that is a Cold War thing, where because Israel just became a better client state for the patronage of the United States, that it just naturally made more sense for them to be more geopolitically aligned. But it was also that many of the Arab states began to adopt a pan-Arab ideology in the 1960s. So they became much more closely aligned with the Soviet Union. And obviously, in 1967, in the Six-Day War, and in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, the Arab states tried to eradicate Israel. This meant that basically they couldn't out-left the Arab countries, and also that they wanted a different patron that was not backing their enemies. So there's a lot more geopolitics going on as far as Israel's foreign relations were occurring. So, like, where does this relation to the United States come in? Well, basically, Israel becomes more and more aligned with them over time, but there's a lot of sketchy stuff that's going on. Who knows about the Kennedy assassination? And also, there's the 1967 USS Liberty incident, in which Israel attacked a United States Navy vessel that was flying a big American flag, so hard to miss, and killed many U.S. servicemen. And one popular theory from that incident was that the USS Liberty was hearing radio transmissions about alleged Israeli war crimes within Egypt. So, to kind of like summarize it, basically in the 50s and 60s, Arab countries gained this socialist pan-Arab philosophy where they want to unite the greater Muslim world under like a broad secularism and then a more socialist mindset. And this essentially puts them in opposition to Israel. So there's like the 1956 Suez Crisis, the two wars in 67 and 73 really pulls Israel out of the socialist project over time and aligns them more with the United States. So when did Israel stop really being socialist? Well, we can define an exact year. In 1977, Menachem Begin becomes prime minister of Israel in a landslide election. Israel is now a right-wing country at and following that point, and essentially they have not stopped being right-wing since. The most dominant political parties in Israel are Yesh Atid. There's also Jewish Home, and Likud is the dominant party. That's Benjamin Netanyahu's party. So Israel is now basically a right-wing country since that point.
That's interesting. If you don't mind me asking, what was why was that such a landslide victory? Was it essentially just the economy stagnating, or is there a more kind of pressing issue?
So the pressing issue here is elite theory, and this is a really interesting point. So to kind of put it in context, and this is going to sound a little disjointed, but it'll make sense. In 1948, there's something called the Altalena Affair. After the British Mandate of Palestine ends, you have all these different paramilitary groups that are Israeli, fiercely Zionist, fiercely nationalistic. Some of them are more militant than others and willing to go to more extreme than others. There's the Haganah and the Irgun, and they all have a leader. So in the 1948 Altalena affair, a ship controlled by one faction was attacked by another faction because the paramilitary forces could not settle their dispute among themselves. Who were the top three commanders in this incident? Yitzhak Rabin, Menachem Begin, and David Ben-Gurion. These three men, David Ben-Gurion was the longest serving prime minister of Israel before Bibi Netanyahu. Menachem Begin was the one who overturned the leftist coalition in 1977, and Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister before his assassination in 1994 by a more radical Israeli. So when you think about it, the political structure within Israel is basically a series of commanders of these paramilitary forces that then enter politics after the creation of the State of Israel and dominate the country continuously for 40 years. So, well, there is like an ideological thing where some are more socialist and some are less. It's really just an elite theory. All of these men who are prime ministers knew each other. Every prime minister of Israel up until Yitzhak Rabin was a high-ranking officer in one of these paramilitary organizations, and all of their conflicts within each other basically escalated politically onto the Israeli stage. So David Ben-Gurion commanded the IDF in 1948. Menachem Begin commanded the Irgun. And they were always, I mean, they literally fought an armed conflict between themselves in the Altalena affair in 1948. And this then reflected itself politically 30 years later.
Okay, so that's really interesting. I didn't realize that they were all from that same stock. So you mentioned a term in there that there was a group that the second prime minister was associated with. What is that group?
The Irgun. So the Irgun was they were responsible for the most violent acts of terrorism against the British prior to their exit.
So this would include the King David Hotel bombing.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, I understand.
So just to put that in context, it was a difference in tactics. Some were willing to kill more civilians. The nationalism present in Israel is something that's honestly astounding to behold, and it shapes the conflict to this day. So I say, like, all this stuff and everything proceeding since the start of the podcast to give you an insight, number one, into the view of like each individual Jewish person, and kind of the historical context that they're coming from, and number two, to make sense of why are the Israelis so militant? Why are they so fierce? What's this internal struggle? And when we look at this most recent round of conflicts, beginning on the October 7th attacks of this year, prior to this, um, in Dizengoff and Rabin Square in Tel Aviv, there were these huge protests. And even last year, there were protests as well. There's a very tiny minority of left wing people within Israel. They're approximately 10% of the population, according to the Pew Research Center. And they were constantly protesting this Israeli government because the Likud government, the right wing government, has been in power since 1977. They have not made any concessions to the left at all. Um, there was an incident where a bunch of Eritrean migrants, immigrants to Israel, were rioting in the street of Tel Aviv, and Israel just killed them all. This is about 2 months ago. So that really rubs the progressives in Israel the wrong way, but they've never had power since 1977. But this was posing a political problem to Bibi. So the conflict itself, in the aftermath of October 7th, Israel immediately formed a unity government. So basically, this is what Israel, both politically and in kind of their mental state, do is when they're in a state of war, they put aside all internal grievances to combat an external enemy. And this is something I'd like to kind of continue with, which is that Israel can't really conceive of itself as a country without the Palestinians. They're the perfect political scapegoat for why something can't be done. And they're also the perfect unifier internally for the in group, right? You always have to preserve the in group against the out group. There's basically two more questions I'd like to answer from my notes, but we'll get into that as far as like show timeline goes.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Carry on. I'm listening.
For sure. Feel free to interject with questions at any point. I know I can kind of ramble. What is so there's a big question, right? So the first question we already answered, why is there so much effort to get moral outrage? The second question is, what is the current status of Israeli sentiment among diaspora Jews? This is pretty interesting because the Zionist perception in the theory of Zionism is that it's this very ephemeral, nationalist, very undefinable thing. There's a lot of calls within nationalist writings about the Jewish soul and the Jewish right to have the land and the strength of the Jew while being cast out of their country. Harav Kook, one of the um, famous rabbis, but also one of the most famous Zionists, he wrote what, and I quote from one of his works, what Eretz Israel, so the land of Israel, means to the Jew can only be felt through the Spirit of the Lord, which is in our people as a whole, through the spiritual cast of the Jewish soul, which radiates its characteristic influence to every healthy emotion. So to get into the mindset of how Jews feel about Israel, the Israeli, like the American and other foreign Jews that immigrate to Israel, adopt this mindset that Zionism, settling the land, working it, building settlements, pushing into the West Bank, etc., that this is like the most healthy and righteous cause that you can have. It preserves the psyche against a lot of these feelings of insecurity that have kind of dominated in like previous decades and centuries. So it's pretty clear cut where they lie. But if you're not a Jew that lives in Israel, how do you feel about it? Well, on the one hand, you're going to make every effort to try and buy into that victim complex. But on the other hand, there's a lot of Jews that are becoming less and less religious over time, demonstrably, because there's like this natalist difference for Jews. So religious Jews have, on average, like 3 to 7 times as many more children as Reform or non-religious Jews. But the fewer children that the non-religious Jews have get more of an education, and they get more of an education at Western universities, and they get more indoctrinated into the power structure, and they lobby for organizations like AIPAC, and they have a lot of political representation. But if they're not nationalist, because they're products of the university and because they're not religious enough to have that nationalist impulse about their own identity as Jews, they just buy in wholesale to the progressive ideology, because that Jewish impulse of Haskalah, wisdom, which I referred to at the start of the podcast, is the pretty clear alignment of Jews with the impulse to become more intellectual, universalist ideology for all, liberalism, progress. Progressivism is like this perfect template to replace their own Jewish identity, while not really ever having to come into contact with it, because most non-religious Jews aren't aware of the halakhic traditions. They don't follow a lot of the religious laws. They don't live with the ultra-religious communities. They're like exiles within the exile group. So that's why some of the things that you see on Twitter and in the news, you see these like Orthodox Jews that are like insanely pro-Palestinian, right? And that's because they come like as a direct descent from these original Americans, Jews that practice the Haskalah impulse.
So what you're saying is that there's essentially within one ethnic group kind of both sides of this discourse at once, right? You have the more secularized, more well-educated kind of progressive Jews who in many cases don't exclusively live in Israel or don't feel as tied to the land, who are more immersed in the traditional progressive mythology of victim and abuser, right? Which you can imagine there's an uncomfortable tension there between, on one hand, the victim narrative that is often used to justify the creation of the state of Israel, and then also, a first world country dropping bombs on, what appears to be not to mince words, essentially a third world open air prison, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's that tension, right? And then you have more traditionally nationalist religious Jews, who are aligned to it seems like we're aligned to the elite structure within Israel, right? The Bibi Netanyahu coalition, which is more militaristic, and kind of see Israel as a solution to the kind of like the long-term ache in the Jewish tradition, basically longing for a place to kind of lay down roots. Is that correct?
Totally correct. And one thing I want to emphasize is like that tension is not like something Jews shy away from. They fully embrace it, right? They love the tension, like based on based on those Zionist speeches I was saying earlier, like being in that state of angst, like there's a reason that Jews are stereotyped as neurotic, high anxiety, emotionally unstable. There's like this part of the Jewish soul which is always in this state of angst, and a lot of that's attributed to the being kicked out of 109 countries, and the mid-century German event. But a lot of it is just the innate nature, I think, of Jewish people. This is why they're trying, I think, really the only way they will be happy is if every person in the world has total consensus and agreement with their side. They can't stand the mildest amount of criticism. And I think, I'm I'm of the more dissident right opinion, where I believe that Israel's, not really justified in continuing to receive gigantic amounts of aid from the United States, and that the Israeli actions are not like perfect and wonderful. I won't go into too much specifics, but I lived there. I was very intimately involved with the activities of the country, and seeing that firsthand, this is not like a welcoming outsider friendly ideology. It's like a militant nationalist mindset, where either you're in and you're out. Um, there's a great paper that I had to read in college. One of its assertions um, is that the elite people, the people who feel this the most, are going to be the most likely to go through that action and to carry out different elements of it and to support it. So you have like your average Jewish person, but then you also have this like leadership or these coalitions of elite political representation that serve to forward its interests. So APAC is one. There's still the world's Jewish, like there's still the World Zionist Organization. There's like innumerable NGOs and political organizations and all these entities, which basically serves to promote these interests around the world.
So
So
one of the things that
go ahead.
I want to bring up, and I see that John Slaughter is asking this as well, which is how does this mesh with kind of the Republican donor class in the U.S., right? These kind of like wacky dispensationalist Christians,
Hmm.
right, who are very, very invested in this situation. So I actually have George Bagby on tomorrow to discuss dispensationalism from a theological angle. But I just wondered if you could maybe talk about how that affects the country, maybe how those people are seen within Israel, and then how their, I guess, weight kind of affects the actions of the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to see this in a stark and clear example, look no further than the most recent Republican presidential debate, where every candidate pretty much, Vivek was, but then he cucked. Every candidate is falling over themselves to support Israel, and we need to eradicate Hamas and all this, XYZ to the nth degree. We have to just absolutely support them no matter what. Where does this come from? So I think there's two elements here. This comes from the dominant sort of non-Trump and non-dissident right faction, which is neoconservatism. A lot of neoconservatives are Protestant, and these basically, I mean, AA had a great stream on Israel, but one of the points that AA made is that these boomers, these Republican boomers, are the bulk of the political donor class for the right. They're the giving the most money, they're pushing the most influence, they're trapped in that boomer mythos that's centered around the mid-century event. So like the foundational event for the right is World War II can't ever happen again. And World War II can't happen ever again because it victimized this group. So we have to always support this group. If we never victimize this group, then we're never going to have the war happen again. There's another element, which is that like since 9/11, um, neoconservatives and the right have really despised Islam and Muslims. They're like just evil. They mistreat their women. They're not forwarding our grand liberal project. They're not enacting gay parades in their countries. Um, these are like antithetical to the neoconservative enlightened vision that we have. Um, and the third element of this is that and I don't agree with this because I'm becoming Eastern Orthodox, but the Protestants have this mindset that Jews are the chosen people and they're going to bring forth the Messiah, Jesus Christ, faster if we can get them all back in Israel, support them as much as possible, and basically they become so successful that they build the third temple. The third temple is a precondition to um, the returning of Christ. So you have these three different elements: big donor class, really disliking Muslims, and wacky Protestant theology that tie together the Republicans in their relentless and honestly totally crazy support of Israel. It's way beyond. The one point, a final point I'd like to make is like, how do Israelis feel about these like boomer neoconservatives and the right support? um, Israelis love Trump. They loved, love Trump. They love that his ambassador to Israel had a daughter that was fighting in the IDF. That's a crazy conflict of interest. They loved that Trump gave crazy amounts of Israel. He did the thing where he put on the kippah and he went to the Western Wall. His son-in-law is Jared Kushner, a Jewish man. So there's all these different areas where Israelis looked at Trump, and he was kind of like the culmination of all these pro-Israel interests and mindset. Also, another big element, and this is kind of a undertone, Trump has a lot of clout in Florida. There's a lot of old boomers, old boomer Protestants, and old boomer Jews that are huge donors in Florida. And there's a lot of these Florida Jews that have dual American Israeli citizenship, and a lot of that money goes into Israel. So, like Sheldon Adelson, highly active in Israel. Mark Rich, highly active in Israel. Multiple Republican and political class Jews are active both for the Trump campaign and within pro-Israel interests.
I think there's also another level of this, which is it's sort of, much like the kind of counter jihad thing is allowable bigotry. It's sort of allowable nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
right? That you get to kind of feel the feelings of being able to unabashedly support a country, right or wrong, in a way that you can't really get away with in America. Like I've said before that I remember somewhere on, conservative talk radio, someone talking about how, the Samson option, which is this idea that, Israel, one, has a nuclear program, which I realize is in contention, but two, would essentially, if they were ever in danger of being overrun, essentially, set the world ablaze, even on, and that is its own thing, right? But this was framed as something cool and awesome, from the American host, right? And so the point in that is that I think for a lot of people, they feel like they can't have that type of unabashed national chauvinism about America. And Israel's sort of a surrogate of that, in addition to all the things that you've meant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with how does that poem go? A cold day when the Saxon begins to hate. the Yeah, it's I mean, and like AA pointed out in his last stream, I mean, he's really been spot on with his analysis. The reason that in the West you're kind of allowed within the establishment parameters to dislike Muslims is because they're the strongest political and demographic force against this GAE liberal project that's going on. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. That's the only real reason why it's allowed. And also because Muslims historically, at least in like memory of a lifetime since 1948, they've always been Israel's enemy. So like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Very, very clear there.
So we've talked about the American perspective, but what does the rest of the world seem to think about this? And then how does Israel broadly feel about, the rest of the world outside of, the Arab world, who they're obviously antagonistic with, and then the US, who they're, cozying up to?
Yeah, for sure. So so what I want to like emphasize is that the view of the world, so the view of other countries besides Israel and Palestine, that is the most critical factor for determining like which side is moral. You've seen a lot of protests in European capitals that are very pro-Palestinian. You've seen a lot of this war drum beating for the pro-Israel side. But like, how do other countries determine guilt? Like, one thing that I was thinking about since October 7th is, why is there a lack of any kind of real assignment of moral legitimacy, right? Everything we're reading in the news is just ideology of, are you more pro-Israel or are you more pro-Palestinian? If you're some dude in Brazil, you're just going to look at it and say, well, like, this is all ideology. I don't really care about one side or the other. But a smarter person, not to disparage the Brazilians, is going to look at the conflict and say legally who is more culpable or responsible. Generally in the West, we consider that, like, if you're legally declared guilty of a crime, you're guilty and you deserve punishment. So that moral language and accusation of guilt, very, very important for the rest of the world to be able to decide who to support. What is the conundrum here? The conundrum is that there's no ability within the Israel-Palestine conflict to assign guilt. And I want to talk a little bit about, like, the UN and the ICC. And this is kind of a tangent, but it'll make sense. So essentially, Hamas in the BBC is declared either militants, and the Times of Israel will declare them as terrorists. This is because there's a very ambiguous definition of who is legally responsible for the war. So it's impossible for the United Nations to settle this conflict, right? There's no meta-political structure that can end it or declare who is right and who is wrong for other countries to fall behind. This is because the United Nations Security Council only has one binding mechanism with enforcement, and the 5 members on it, Russia, China, France, the UK, and the US, unilateral veto power. So these 5 states are split between Eastern and Western geopolitical interests, so they're never going to pass a legal or moral binding resolution on this conflict. So another element is, well, if we want to end this conflict and we want to assign guilt to a party once and for all, who can do it? There's generally only one considered authority, the International Criminal Court. They have the ability to prosecute and charge and sentence to prison anybody that they have an indictment and have legitimate grounds for. This is never going to happen for Israel or Palestine. They're never going to extradite one of their own, especially in leadership, to the International Criminal Court. And even if they did, it would be a huge reputational risk. So this then runs into geopolitics a lot, right? Foreign views matter on this conflict. The United States is generally pro-Israel. Russia and China look at this and say, hey, the United States is pro-Israel. We're going to be more neutral. We're going to advocate for a humanitarian pause. We want to minimize conflict in Gaza. Or, like the Arab countries, you can take a countervailing view and say, you know what? Screw the Sunni-Shia divide. Screw the past wars that we fought that have been unified or disunified against Israel. The Israel-Palestine conflict is the single most uniting ideological shift in geopolitics that's going on right now. Every Arab country is like setting aside their internal disputes, which have characterized most of their history, in order to go after Israel and condemn it and support the Palestinians. This is also backed with more cooperation between the Arab countries and China and Russia. So the geopolitics here is getting messy. So I'll get back to your original question, which was, remind me, about foreign views on it.
Yeah. So essentially, how does Israel feel towards the criticism they've received from the rest of the world? Like, for instance, one of the things that I saw was essentially the Israel's delegates to the UN were wearing yellow stars of David, obviously.
Yeah, that's right.
A deeply symbolic action. And then essentially there was some vote where this was trotted out where the vast majority, it was something like 180 countries voted against them. And they essentially said 185 countries are anti-Semitic, right? At which point it's like, okay, guys, this is effectively a meaningless term.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to like crystallize it, like, how does Israel view themselves on the world stage with this? What are they going to do? Right? They can't, I guess they are choosing to accuse the entire world of anti-Semitism, which is really stupid because they're relying on the rest of the world for all of their economic and military support. But, I want to talk a little bit about the individual Israelis that I met over there and what their opinions were. Like, how do they feel about all of this? How do they feel about other countries being pro or against them? one such mindset that I've encountered with Israelis is that, hey, people look at conflicts in South America and Africa and Asia. So why is there like undue attention for this conflict? Um, my response to that is that every other conflict has made steps toward either being resolved in favor of one side, or there's been a treaty or a ceasefire or some kind of diplomatic resolution or just a total stalemate where both sides are just quiet. You've never had a conflict since 1948 in the world where it is just so impossible to make peace. It's always been a meme. It's been a meme on like The Simpsons, the cultural consciousness, the joke in the Clinton administration, the Bush era. You know, no president's ever going to make peace in the Middle East. That's why it captures the attention of the foreign views. So that's my answer to the Israelis. Another Israeli opinion is that, hey, people are always saying the Palestinians are victims, but they ignore all the violence that the Palestinians commit against Israel. Um, this is because of the political divisions in Western countries and the rest of the world, where the left gains by labeling Hamas instead of terrorists, they call them freedom fighters. And the right fits into it perfectly and says these freedom fighters are terrorists. So the labeling and the assignment of who's responsible or culpable for it, there's always going to be like a bias that's kind of generally just against Israel. They have the power, right? Israel has the power in this conflict of most of the military arms that it's sent it that hasn't been shipped to Ukraine. They have tons and tons of money continuously being passed by Congress for them. And they also, being the powerful party, have the more viable route for ending the conflict. Like Israel can stop this conflict when it chooses. Um, it could always stable out or settle down, but essentially there's no real way for Israel to admit to itself that it should stop the conflict.
Well, and it goes back to what you said about Israel sort of needing the Palestinians as kind of a point of definition, right? That is a negative definition, but integral to what it means to be in the state of Israel. And I'll be the first to admit, I very rarely get into moral language in politics. Like, it's not how I think about things. You know, I come from an economics background, and so I tend to adopt that frame when thinking, especially about geopolitics. But like, I have to admit, as someone who doesn't particularly care about either one of these countries, that it has become a little bit difficult to stomach. You know, that it does sort of seem like, look, I get it. You know, the Hamas attack was, was horrific. A lot of people died, especially a lot of civilians. But I mean, what's your allowable multiplier? Is it a 2x? Is it a 3x? Like, once it starts to get to like 10 or 12 times the amount of civilians, it's like, hey guys, can we calm down? Like, this is just getting gross. You know, and not to put it in such simple terms, but I think that this has created a wider crack in culture, right? So we've talked about the crack in progressive culture, but there's one happening in conservative culture as well. So you and I were kind of talking back and forth about what this has done in the conservative scene, right? So at least currently, while we're talking, Ben Shapiro, who is very Zionist, and Candace Owens, who I think is almost uniquely and totally uninteresting, are having a massive fight about essentially Zionism. And what's interesting is, Candace Owens is, to put it mildly, not an intellectual leader. She's not really putting out these kind of like new complicated theories. But the same crack is running through a lot of places, right? Tucker Carlson spoke to Candace Owens, and there's a clip of him going around where he basically brings up the question of, why did these Republican Zionist donors pull their funding from universities the instant that Hamas starts to become popular on college campus? And he basically asked the question of like, well, where have you guys been for 30 years? When they've been saying things about people with a less direct connection to the state of Israel. right?
Mhm.
And this is an interesting crack, because if you would have asked me a year ago, I would have said that people like Glenn Beck, people like Ben Shapiro, the Zionists were integral to the core of the American conservative movement. But it seems like more and more they are becoming isolated. Now, I don't mean to overstate the case. You've mentioned the recent RNC debate where Israel was front and center, but all the same, this has been an interesting movement over the Overton window.
Right, and I think the core of it is that the boomer crap doesn't carry with the younger generation. Like Glenn Beck going on his, uh, you know, kind of live stream thing and saying he wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of Israel asking for Israeli citizenship because he loves Israel so much. And Ben Shapiro's emotional hysteria. I saw this quote. The spat on Twitter, for those who don't know, is that Candace Owens stated like a literal quote from the Bible, and Ben Shapiro is basically like outraged about this, and it's just the Jewish hysteria around this. It's like, I'm speaking as a Jewish person, obviously, like it's way over the top. Like you can't make everyone all the time emotionally hysterical about your conflict and have that myth just perpetuate throughout all time for all people. Um, it also can't work politically. Any political influence from the Republican donor class that's going to Israel is not going where it needs to be, which is the United States. The United States should not be sending more money than it needs to for Israel. And we shouldn't base our entire foreign policy and political structure on the right with Israel. So there's a lot of cracks there that are appearing on the right. I'm way less pro-Israel than I was when I was there. But also, you know, it's it's just cementing this myth on the left that like no matter what, Israel always is, Israelis are always going to look out for their own interests. This is not a two-way street. It's you have to be outraged, and what do you get in return? Um, I don't really think that Americans get anything for their support of Israel, besides what, like some empty political statements. I mean, that's basically it. Um, it's very, very disheartening, and I think also it's not a political paradigm that can continue. I think not the conflict itself, because the conflict is going to wrap up in a few months once Israel realizes it can't push other Palestinians out, and it can't settle it diplomatically or legally or with negotiations from the United States. So eventually, there's just going to be a reduction. It's just going to stop. Um, but I think the broader metapolitical implications here are that the right and the left need to excise this political tumor, which is always prioritizing the Israel lobby and Israeli foreign interests. And until that happens, um, there's not really going to be a change in the political establishment or on conventional figures between the right and the left on what they should actually care about, which is uh, the welfare of your native born American men and their families and their social structure and all these myriad of issues that the country is facing. Like, on the one hand, you're asked to be morally outraged continuously about this conflict and anti-Semitism and the war until the end of time. But on the other hand, you're walking down the street and you're seeing homeless people. Your personal security is not what it was 10 years ago. Your ability to have a family is limited. You're making less money. The economy's worse. How many things can you be morally outraged about that don't immediately concern yourself? The answer is not much.
Well, and that's another interesting dynamic in this, is that I was speaking with Thomas about this and sort of analogized it to holding a heavy weight, right? That you're sort of fighting against gravity. And that sort of strength picking the weight up has, it seems like, been money from America, money from Germany. And when you look at the situation on the ground, like, Israel obviously is well fortified, but let's be honest, it's not the most defensible area. They're
No.
surrounded on all sides by enemies.
Mhm.
And it sort of begs the question, like, well, what happens when that support goes away, because it seems like that support is going away. And as much as I hate to say it, it seems to largely be the fault of the Zionist movement who created the state in the first place.
Exactly. And the Zionist movement, I mean, obviously it still exists on paper, but that great zeitgeist, that great capturing, you can't call it a Faustian spirit, right, in the Spenglerian sense, but it is a biospirit of the Jewish people. That was something that occurred at a point in time. And that's not something that Jews have actively been able to maintain. I think, like, if I can say a profound insight, the Jewish people, their motivating spirit, biospirit, um, it has a duality between I'm a victim, the whole world is against me, versus I must, you know, I must get as much as I can. I must work as hard as I can. I must strive to have as much control and to be politically represented. They've forgotten all the lessons that they've learned through Zionism, which is that these things take a huge amount of work and that you need patronage and that you need to earn the respect of donors and peers and that you need to be well regarded on the world stage. Instead, all they've left themselves with in Israel is moral indignation and outrage and calling you an anti-Semite. And I'll just say, like, as a Jewish person, that is the stupidest strategy. Like, nobody really likes a whiny victim that calls themselves a victim. I mean, it's not something you can, you support a whiny victim out of pity. And Zionism is at its core, in the earlier philosophers, like I was stating earlier, it's not about pitying itself. It's about carving out, making an ethno-nationalist project, having strength, projecting power. Um, if this podcast has seemed really chaotic and all over the place, it's because it's a very, you know, all of these different elements of Judaism are basically conflicting with each other. And it's not something that's sustainable through time. And one thing that I learned from meeting many, many people over there in the country was that, like, Israel has terrible PR for itself. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs can't conduct itself on the international stage. They can't do diplomacy. Um, they can't really project military power into Gaza beyond um, war crimes or like total or just total like blunders with high civilian casualty counts. Um, and it's just like, how long is the United States expected to support this and expected to buy into this myth when we're now 80 years away from the mid-century German event, and it's lost its cultural staying power outside of a single generation of people that are going to pass on within the next 20 years. So,
Well, and that's been something that we've seen in, shall we say, revealed preference in all of this. Again, as I've made clear, I'm not particularly invested in either Israel or Palestine, right? They're not my people. But when you see platforms like, for instance, TikTok, that are very, very, that are very young, right? They're overwhelmingly, in support of Palestine, and yet, the company I work for, which is, shall we say, rather old, the very first thing I get after this happens is an email from corporate basically taking donations for Israel. And so you're right, it does seem to be very much related to age. And, as much as we kind of joke about the day of the pillow when the boomers are finally gone, it does sort of seem that, when that happens, unless there's a drastic change, support will dry up very quickly. All right. Yeah, so Philo had to run out for a little bit. If y'all want to send any questions in chat, okay, cool. Now would be a good time for it. But while we do that, Philo, we're sort of wrapping up. We have a few questions, but
for sure.
If people want to find you, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel. It's under my name here, Philo's Miscellany. I do a lot of kind of book reviews and analysis of different kind of forgotten books on the right. There's a lot of great content out there, hard to find. My next video coming out is going to be an analysis of all these different false Jewish messiahs throughout Jewish history, where I'm going to kind of go through their failures. Part of that's, again, because I'm becoming Eastern Orthodox, but part of it also is that I really want to dig into this Jewish mindset as deep as I can. Yeah.
Okay, so scan through the questions. Some of them we already addressed, and of the ones I can read, there's one that I think is interesting, which is can you explain to me the conflict, particularly as it relates to LGBT issues? Because it does seem like on one hand, there are very extremely conservative Jews in Israel, and yet Tel Aviv in particular is kind of an infamously gay city. So how is that, and kind of the more socially progressive issues, how does that kind of fit into all of this?
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, there's about 10% of the Jewish the population of Israel that's broadly progressive or left-leaning or can be categorized as such. Vast majority of the other 90% are either center right, right, or far right. And um, in terms of how this like shakes out, every single one of those leftists lives either on like some hippie kibbutz where they just farm olives all day and go swimming, or they live in Tel Aviv. And Tel Aviv is known as the gay capital of the Middle East. Um, just, I think every gay person in Israel lives in Tel Aviv. It's always been the center of the socialist movement. It's always been the center of the progressive movement within Zionism. And it does not have the religious baggage that Jerusalem has. So Jerusalem, other important cities, Eilat, Haifa, um, Beersheba, these are all cities where there's a like settler right wing, if I dare say, based mindset where like they're religious Jews, they're not pro gay, they're not supportive of it. If they have a gay kid, they basically just say like go live in Tel Aviv. A lot of these progressive gay Jews don't join the army, so a lot of them resist efforts to conscript them. Every Israeli has to do a period of service, 2 to 3 years, at the age of 18. And so a lot of these gay Jews don't fight for the country. So they're cancer everywhere. I probably shouldn't say that, but yeah, that's just generally how it breaks down. Like most of the country is right wing or conservative and religious and Zionist, and the ones that aren't and are very progressive, left leaning people that are gay, they live in Tel Aviv. That's just how it breaks down. It's like the city that is designed to cater to them. There's a lot of nightclubs there, very active nightlife, a lot of stuff going on. Beautiful city, but just filled with them.
Well, fair enough, Philo. And again, thank you so much. This was very well prepared, and I learned a lot. I didn't talk much, and that's just because, not only did you have a ton of material, but I didn't have much to add. It was really well done, man. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I know it was kind of all over the place, but it's a very very complicated idea with a lot of history and baggage, and yeah, I'm just hope you're able to get the structure of it. And thank you really once again for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to come talk, and mad respect to you and the rest of the people in the dissident right.
Well, great. Thank you so much, man. And obviously, you should check out Philo's YouTube channel. It's well worth your time. I've been subscribed to it for quite a while before I'd even met him, and I enjoyed it a lot. Anyway, like I said, guys, if you want to support my work, the best way you can do that is to spread the show around. This is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, pretty much anywhere podcasts exist. And as you can guess from the topic of this show, social media platforms do not like me. So if this is ever going to grow, it's going to require a little bit of guerrilla marketing, right? So send it to someone who you think would be interested in it. I'd appreciate it. If you want to support the show more directly, one of the best ways to do that is to check out Axios. Actually, I think Philo and I are both Axios customers. Is that correct?
That is correct. And plug for Axios, because he just got me to a 350 deadlift, which I'm very proud about. Very intuitive, conscientious, absolutely shredded individual. the founder of Axios. And if you get on that plan, in 3 months, your whole life is going to be changed. So
No,
that's
yeah.
my
I
plug.
mean, that's not a joke. There's probably, a couple dozen of us in it, and then in the group chat, everyone's kind of posting, their lists and all that. And Philo is not joking. He's been in there for a little bit, and a 350 to deadlift, that's serious poundage, and he's done really well with it. So that's an unorthodox ad, but I think one that fits pretty well. And again, Philo, thank you so much for coming out, man.
Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.